If Jesus rose from the dead, then Christianity is true and anything opposed to Christianity is false. Today we're going to look at 5 key tests used by historians to determine which explanation of an event is best. Then we'll cover key facts surrounding the events of the life of Jesus that have strong historical evidence and are agreed upon by the vast majority of scholars. Then we will apply those 5 historical tests to 7 different possible explanations of our key facts. Let's start with the 5 historical criteria. The best explanation of an event will have, number 1, greater explanatory scope, meaning it will explain more of the evidence. Number 2, greater explanatory power. It will explain the data more effectively. Number 3, it will be more plausible. Number 4, it will be less contrived. It won't require adopting many new beliefs that have no independent evidence. Number 5, it will be disconfirmed by fewer accepted beliefs. It won't conflict with as many accepted beliefs. Here are the key facts to be explained. Jesus was crucified. Jesus was buried. Jesus' tomb was discovered empty. The disciples and many others believed Jesus appeared to them. Saul went from an enemy of Christianity to being a follower of Jesus. James was converted from being a skeptic to being a follower of Jesus as well. Let's evaluate now the different hypotheses surrounding these facts. Number 1, the disciples stole the body. This was the original hypothesis of first century opponents of Christianity. This hypothesis has a mixed explanatory scope. It explains the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances to the disciples, they lied, and the origin of their supposed belief in the resurrection, they lied. It does not explain, however, the conversion of skeptics and enemies, such as James and Saul, who were not part of the disciples' group and claimed to have seen Jesus risen again. It also does not explain the conversion of other followers of Jesus who claimed to see him risen to life again. The explanatory power falls short for this theory in several ways. The fatal flaw is that this theory provides no explanation for the origin of the disciples' belief in the resurrection and their willingness to be tortured and killed for this belief. People don't die for what they know is a lie. Second, there seems to be no motive for them to steal the body. This conspiracy would not provide money, power, or any other benefit. This theory is also implausible. In a first century Jewish context, if your Messiah figure was killed, you would decide he wasn't actually the Messiah. There was not an expectation of resurrection, and so the whole idea of stealing a body to fake a resurrection would have been foreign to the followers of Jesus. The conspiracy theory that each of the disciples was willing to throw away their life to follow a lie is very contrived and does not have a shred of evidence to support the claim. Our general knowledge of conspiracy theories also disconfirms this theory. Number 2, the apparent death / swoon hypothesis. The idea is simply that Jesus never died on the cross. He merely fainted and later revived in the tomb and escaped. This theory has weak explanatory scope. It would explain the empty tomb and somewhat the appearances of Jesus to the disciples. It does not explain the conversion of James, Saul, and other enemies or skeptics of Jesus. Unfortunately for this hypothesis, it provides no explanatory power. First, there's no evidence that Jesus survived the crucifixion, and many independent evidences that he did die from the crucifixion. Second, how would Jesus have revived in the tomb without medical attention? How would he have moved the stone from the tomb's entrance in such a weakened state? How would a half-dead Jesus convince his disciples and even his enemies of his resurrection, since seeing him in that state would make them think he didn't die? The explanatory power of this theory is incredibly weak. Plausibility: the Romans knew how to kill people. Not only was Jesus whipped and beaten prior to the crucifixion, but his side was also pierced by a spear to make sure he was dead. The theory is highly contrived and has zero evidence. The theory is also disconfirmed by our medical knowledge and facts regarding the crucifixion. Number 3, displaced body. After Joseph of Arimathea buried the body in the tomb, the body was later moved to a common graveyard and forgotten. The explanatory scope of this theory is weak. The only thing it explains is the empty tomb, not the appearances of Jesus, the origin of the disciples' belief in the resurrection, or the conversions of skeptics and enemies of Jesus. The explanatory power is equally weak. It does not explain much of any data, and it does not explain why Joseph or whoever moved the body from the tomb didn't simply correct the error of those saying Jesus was resurrected. The theory is highly implausible. There's no legitimate reason why Jesus would be buried in a tomb and later moved to a different tomb, and no evidence this occurred. Jewish law did not even permit the body to be moved later unless it was to a family tomb. The theory is contrived and lacks any evidence. The theory is also disconfirmed by what we know about Jewish burial practices for criminals. Number 4, hallucination hypothesis. The disciples simply experienced hallucinations of the risen Jesus. He did not really rise again. This hypothesis has mixed explanatory scope because it does not explain the empty tomb, the conversion of skeptics and enemies like James and Saul, and it does not actually explain the disciples' belief in the resurrection. Hallucinations about a close friend who died would not lead you to conclude that they had bodily risen to life again. The explanatory power is also lacking because it does not explain the facts surrounding the resurrection, but a larger issue is that people do not hallucinate in groups and do not hallucinate the exact same thing. The appearances of Jesus after his death and resurrection included many group appearances, and a hallucination does not explain that. It also does not explain the conversion of James, Saul, and other enemies of Jesus. The hypothesis is implausible because it doesn't explain the empty tomb, conversion of skeptics, rise of Christianity, the disciples' belief in the resurrection, and it assumes that group hallucinations are not only possible, but occurred multiple times in multiple places, and with the same person being the subject of the hallucination. The theory is contrived. It has to assume that the disciples, apostles, and even skeptics of Jesus were highly susceptible to hallucinations and all had the same exact hallucination. And it is disconfirmed by the data we have on how hallucinations actually work. Before we examine our last theory, let's walk through 2 more options that often come up. Number 5, it's just a legend. This is a somewhat popular explanation from skeptics, but it does not explain the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances, the disciples' belief, or the conversion of James, Saul, and others. It does not fit with the evidence of early and multiply attested sources, including the Creed in 1 Corinthians 15, which is dated to the 30s AD and possibly within weeks of the events themselves. Number 6, miracles don't happen. This is not so much a hypothesis, but more of an a priori commitment to disbelieve anything miraculous. It does not explain any of the data. Saying miracles don't or can't happen explains none of the facts surrounding the resurrection, and it's likely begging the question. It also ignores the testimony of many miracle stories, both in ancient times and even today. Number 7, the resurrection hypothesis. The resurrection hypothesis is that Jesus really did rise from the dead. It has far greater explanatory scope than any competitors because it explains all of the data. Jesus was crucified. Jesus was buried. Jesus' tomb was discovered empty. The disciples and others believed Jesus appeared to them. Conversion of Saul, conversion of James. The explanatory power of the resurrection is also undeniable. If Jesus rose from the dead, then we would expect the tomb to be empty, Jesus to appear to his followers, their belief in his resurrection, their willingness to suffer, be tortured, and killed, and the conversion of skeptics and enemies to himself. On plausibility, William Lane Craig writes, quote, "The plausibility of Jesus' resurrection grows exponentially once we consider it in its historical context, namely Jesus' unparalleled life and radical personal claims, and in its philosophical context, namely the evidence for God's existence. But is the hypothesis less contrived? Some scholars say the resurrection hypothesis is contrived because people don't rise from the dead. For an atheist, it does add the supposition that God exists. Interestingly, though, if you believe that God exists, then the resurrection hypothesis does not add any new belief to your thinking or your worldview, because it fits with what theists already believe, namely that God can do miracles. The only accepted belief that would disconfirm the resurrection is that people do not rise from the dead. But this does nothing to disconfirm the hypothesis that God raised Jesus from the dead. You can hold that people do not naturally rise from the dead while also believing that God raised Jesus from the dead. The philosophical commitment against God and against miracles is really the only piece lacking in the resurrection hypothesis. If you don't believe in God, or you don't believe that miracles exist, then I recommend checking out our playlist on the existence of God and our playlist on miracles. In summary, the resurrection hypothesis has by far the greatest explanatory scope, best explanatory power, is plausible given the unique context of Jesus' life, is not excessively contrived, and is not disconfirmed by accepted knowledge. There is no better explanation than the truth that Jesus rose from the dead.